Hi, I'm Josh Block, host of Uncover Escaping NXIVM from CBC Podcasts. I pull back the curtain on the secretive self-help group that experts call a cult and follow one woman's harrowing journey to get out. The podcast was featured in Rolling Stone magazine and named one of the best podcasts of 2018 in The Atlantic. Listen to Uncover Escaping NXIVM on CBC Listen or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a CBC podcast.
So we are just past the midway point of the 2020 Olympic Games in Tokyo. And way back when organizers were planning these games, they wanted them to be a landmark for gender equality. Events were added for women. The competition schedule was made to give equal prominence to men and women's sports. On the Canadian team, women have been excelling, in case you didn't see that soccer game this morning, winning the vast majority of Canada's medals. And yet...
The Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games president Yoshiro Mori earlier announcing he's to resign from his post. This following his recent sexist remarks about women. The 83-year-old...
All I've ever wanted out of my basketball career has been to rep Canada at the Olympics. Last year my teammates and I qualified for Tokyo, but right now I'm being forced to decide between being a breastfeeding mom or an Olympic athlete. I can't have them both.
She just doesn't
Kyle,
seem on.
She's going off the floor.
Something's up. I don't know what it is.
Simone Biles stepping back from the team and individual all around because of her mental health.
And if you've been on social media, there have been some mixed reviews about all of this and the move. This is from Aaron Wright, who is a Texas deputy attorney general. He called her a, quote, selfish, childish national embarrassment.
Sexist remarks, rules that discriminate against nursing mothers, and conversation around an elite female athlete's, quote, mental toughness. These might be the gender equality games on paper, but on the pitch, the balance beam, or the court, things look awfully different. Kavitha A. Davidson is a sports writer for The Athletic, and she's the co-author of a recent book called Loving Sports, When They Don't Love You Back, and she joins me from New York. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you.
You're a journalist. Obviously, you must be a sports fan, too, given you spend so much time writing about it and thinking about it. How do you think the Olympics are living up to their goals so far when it comes to gender equality?
Well, the Olympics have been working toward this point for quite a while now. London 2012 was actually the first time that every country had sent a woman, had female representation in their ranks. 3 countries had to be forced by the IOC to do that. Yeah. It was also the first time that women's boxing was added to the Olympic program so that every event now had equal representation as well. So this has been in the works for almost going on 10 years, if not longer. At the same time, I think we're seeing that some of the old tropes, some of the old narratives have definitely taken shape. And you just played some comments made about athletes that I think you can definitely point to progress still needing a ways to go.
Yeah, and we'll get to some of those specifics. But the IOC did give guidelines. This is kind of incredible, but they gave guidelines to journalists about how to avoid sexist narratives and stereotypes when talking about female athletes. I mean, just the fact that they had to give those guidelines tells you something. But how has the commentary been in general from what you've been hearing?
I think it's very country specific, frankly. Over in the U.S., I think that we've had a lot of conversations about how that language needs to be tweaked, about how language matters in what we're covering. And I think that it also matters that a lot of the journalists who are covering the Olympics in the States are women themselves. Right. And that will always obviously make a difference when it comes to specific language. At the same time, again, narratives are taking shape that even if the specific language isn't offensive, can sometimes point to the offensive nature of how women's sports are not covered in the same way.
So let's start with sort of the most glaring example or the most obvious example, and that's the issue of what women are wearing when they compete. What do you make of the pushback that we are seeing? For instance, the German gymnastics team all wore like one piece to compete. Is that a change? Is there a benefit when we see those kinds of double standards?
The only benefit of upholding a double standard in uniforms is to sexualize female athletes. Yeah, and this is something that has been going on for years. Several years ago, the Australian women's basketball team was forced by their national governing committee to wear these kind of skin-tight bodysuits, and they they rejected it. They had to wear them, but they did not. They were very outspoken about how uncomfortable they were, about the fact that it didn't actually help them perform better on the floor. And the officials in charge flat out said that this was a marketing push, that their number one priority in governing female athletes was to make them as sexualized and as sexually marketable as possible. Now, we're seeing that to this day. We're obviously seeing that in the most glaring example with the Norwegian beach handball team that rejected the bikini requirement. And I think the idea is just that it should be a choice. It should not be mandated, and there should be the same standards of uniform for men as there are for women. And there probably and most likely are women who would prefer to wear bikinis, not because it sexualizes them, but because it makes them comfortable. And that's okay too. But I think the idea of having some kind of standard is really important here.
So let's get into a couple of the specific high profile examples of tropes and sexism that maybe you think is being displayed here. Simone Biles being slammed for dropping out of the competition, although I should point out she has said she's going to compete in the beam medal event. So that's exciting. Naomi Osaka, who's the Black Japanese American tennis player, she's also faced a lot of criticism this year. How do you think the fact that these elite athletes who are also women plays into the criticism they're getting? Is it about them being women? Is it about is it about mental health? Are the two connected?
I think it's everything wrapped up in one. I think if you look specifically at Naomi Osaka and her pulling out of the French Open several weeks ago, it continued a conversation that we've been having around athletes, male and female, and their mental health, and trying to get over not only the stigma of just talking about mental health, but the idea that mental health should be conflated with weakness. I mean, we're talking about elite athletes at the highest levels of their sport. They've obviously proven that they are both physically and mentally tough, and the idea that talking about mental health can signal anything otherwise just shows how little we understand about the conversation around mental health. With Simone Biles, I think the added element that does speak to gender is that so many people who either wanted to separate the mental health from the physical aspect of gymnastics don't give gymnastics their due in being such a dangerous sport. And I think one of the reason that happens is because, at least in the States, the most prominent faces like Simone Biles are women who wear leotards, who wear makeup, and that defies what people might want to point to as toughness or as a dangerous sport. But don't make any assumptions otherwise. Gymnastics is an incredibly dangerous sport. And I think that, we can go down the line and talk about how mental health, how it's easy to label people as weak when they are women, and when they are talking about mental health, but the courage and the strength that it takes to actually have that conversation. And men have been starting this conversation as well, I will say, starting in the NBA bubble last year. But I do think that it's difficult to separate the characterization of these women as either, betrayers of their sport or betrayers of their country, partly because the underlying assumption there is also that they really weren't proper athletes to begin with.
Yeah, I did see. I mean, there was a lot of support for Simone Biles as well. I should point out, and from other athletes as well, like Michael Phelps was very outspoken about his own mental health, and he applauded what she did. How much do you think race intersects with gender, though, when we're talking about Simone or Naomi?
I think it does a lot. I think especially with Simone, she is the face for the States, she is the face of our Olympic Games. It was obviously disappointing for a lot of fans that she had to pull out. But I think it also speaks to this larger issue of Black athletes in particular are exploited and are only really taken seriously and are expected to be, they're accepted in this athletic realm as the face of a sport or a face of a country until they mess up in some way. And I think especially Black women who have been talking about this for decades now, the expectation that Black women have to be 100% perfect all the time is such a burden. And when a little bit of that falters, what we need to remember is that athletes are human beings. Athletes don't stop being Black women when they step onto a gymnastics floor. And that burden comes with them. They carry that burden with them as well. And just recognizing the athlete as a holistic human being, their identities and their demographics and their flaws as well is really important.
Yeah, that they can be vulnerable just like everybody else. Given all these issues, gender equality, racial justice, all these different things, these big issues that do pop up during the Olympics, are you still able to enjoy them? Or do you only look at them through that lens? Are you having fun watching?
It's funny. This is basically the premise of the book that I co-wrote with Jessica Luther, which is every fan has every chapter is deals with a different moral dilemma and how we maintain our fandom despite all of these systemic problems that we see. Institutions. One chapter is specifically dedicated to the Olympics. The Olympics are highly problematic, even without all of the things that you and I have discussed today. The Olympics are such an economic boondoggle. They militarize local police. There's so many issues there. And yet I love watching them. I really do. And it's very difficult from a moralistic standpoint to reconcile those two things. But, on the one hand, the Olympics are also the biggest global showcase for women's sports. It's the only time we get to see not just women's sports, but some of these events that we don't really pay attention to. And there is something about having national pride as well. So it is always very difficult to reconcile those two things. And it's hard for me as a journalist, knowing kind of how the sausage is made, not to think of all of these problems.
Well, thank you for getting us thinking about them this morning, Kavitha. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. That's
Kavitha A. Davidson, sports writer for The Athletic, co-author of the recent book, Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back.
I'm Nala Ayed, host of Ideas. In this age of clickbait and online shouting, Ideas is a meeting ground for people who want to deepen their understanding of the world. Join me as we crack open a concept to see how it plays out over place and time and how it matters today. From the rise of authoritarianism to the history of cult movies, no idea is off limits. Ideas is on the CBC Listen app or wherever you find your podcasts.
From CBC Podcasts and The Fifth Estate, Brainwashed is a multi-part investigation into the CIA's experiments in mind control. From the Cold War and MKUltra to the so-called War on Terror, we learn about a psychiatrist who used his patients as human guinea pigs and what happens when the military and medicine collide. Listen to Brainwashed on the CBC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Jasmine Mian is a former Canadian Olympic athlete who lives in Calgary. She competed in wrestling in 2016 in Rio. She says change needs to come from the top.
The IOC executive is still 2/3 men, and coaches, I think 90% of the coaches in Rio were men. So we have decision makers that are overwhelmingly men. They don't maybe even think that some of this should change or that it's been a problem. And so I think we're slowly starting to see different policies come in and push back. We see decisions to not allow nursing mothers to bring their babies to the games, or, no consideration in the qualifying processes that you might need to accommodate for women being pregnant. It's only also very recent that we had an athlete of both genders carry the flag at the opening ceremonies. And that's how China got their first woman flag bearer. And so, I think seeing this pushback is really important if we want to see the games be more inclusive. And I think that's going to also start with not just, the medal performances that we see of women and the pushback of the athletes is one thing. But I think where there's still a lot of change to be made is making sure that we have women at the IOC table, more women coaches, and that's how we can start to probably come up with better policies in the first place.
Jasmine Mian was part of a 2016 Olympic team where 16 of Canada's medals were won by women, 6 by men. If you go by those numbers, Canadian women athletes are making great strides. It's happening again in Tokyo. Canadians have won medals in 14 events so far, all but one by women. In Tokyo, overall, 49% of the athletes are women, but those numbers probably don't tell the whole story. Michelle Donnelly is an assistant professor of sports management at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning.
So 49% is actually, it's good. It's a long way from the 14% that there was back in 1968. How has the push for gender equality at the Olympics helped women athletes, do you think?
I think, absolutely. In terms of numbers is where we've seen the most improvement with respect to gender equality. And, having those role models is extremely important, as well as having a national sports system that recognizes the need to invest in women's sports because there are medals for women at the games, right? And when that is the focus, then if you don't make that investment, then you potentially leave a lot of medals on the table, certainly as we've seen between Rio and Tokyo with the number of medals won by Canadian women athletes.
It was actually back in 1996 at the Atlanta Games that they called them the Women's Games because the number of athletes had reached 36% at that point. At these games, nearly half, as I said, half the athletes are women. But what are those numbers not telling us in terms of the full story here?
Yeah, it's really only a fraction of the story about gender equality is told by the numbers, right? And everything that you've just discussed with the two previous guests in terms of how women are treated, the representations of women athletes in the media. There are differences in uniform requirements. In some sports, there are actually differences in the rule sets that men and women play by, or the distances that they compete over, the equipment that they use. So when the discussion about gender equality is limited to numbers, as it really has been by the International Olympic Committee, you're not actually addressing equality in a substantive way. And that's really what remains to be done. And certainly, I think increasing the number of women in decision-making positions is crucial there, but also really embracing a definition of gender equality that is about more than reaching 50% women, 50% men.
Yeah. I mean, there's still these real gender-specific controversies that come up. I spoke on my TV show with the boxer Mandy Bujold, who had to fight to qualify because she had been off part of the time caring for her baby. Basketball player Kim Goucher was fighting to bring her nursing baby with her to Tokyo, which seems sort of like a basic right. What does that tell you about how the IOC views athletes who are women and who also happen to be mothers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really this interesting situation that we have where we've seen on the media representation end of things some decrease in the sexualization of women athletes, but a real increase in talking about athletes as mothers, certainly women athletes. And then you still have, right, these institutionalized practices in sport that really don't allow space for mothering alongside being an elite level athlete. So definitely we need to see more recognition of that. And really, I mean, expanding the discussion about elite athletes and family in general is going to be crucial. You know, there's sort of a pretense here that really only women have responsibility for childcare and child rearing, which is really problematic. I mean, there are a lot of men at Rio who have left small children at home and families at home. And because there's never been an expectation, right, to make space for that with men athletes, that lack of attention to family responsibilities has continued along to women athletes. And really what it requires is an overall review to understand athletes more fully, right? As people who are elite level athletes, but who have families and who have other responsibilities beyond their sport. And that would be beneficial for all athletes, men and women.
Can I bring up the issue of safe sport too and sexual abuse in sport? Because obviously that is part of the conversation. It's certainly become more prevalent over the past number of years, particularly in gymnastics, I would think. Jasmine Mian, who we talked to at the beginning there, the wrestler, she's also been active on this issue. Here's what she has to say about how it's been allowed to fester.
And there should be some basic workplace standards, some, human rights and human resources practices that you would find in any workplace should be afforded to athletes as well. And I think for a long time it wasn't. And that's why we see these horrible instances of abuse that have happened in sport, because you take a group of people who really want to win a gold medal, and you have a coach who says, I can get you that gold medal, but you just have to listen to every single thing I say. That's, a pretty dangerous situation to be in, because you have such athletes who just feel so trapped and want to win so badly that I think we've been willing to accept certain practices and standards that we just never should have been willing to accept.
I bring up this question of progress on this issue because over the weekend, Rugby Canada had to fire the head of its national development program, Jamie Cudmore, over remarks that he made about the Canadian women's rugby team that he put on social media. How much progress are you seeing on this issue of creating a safe space, abuse-free space in sports?
I think some progress, certainly Canada's adoption of the Universal Code of Conduct for the prevention of maltreatment in sport, the UCCMS, is really a move in the right direction, I think, sort of expanding our understanding of maltreatment beyond kind of criminal standards for abuse and harassment. That's really a positive. I think we have to recognize the work that athletes, and very often women athletes, are doing to advocate for this change and this progress in Canada. Without athletes being willing to tell their stories and go public and really, put themselves in really difficult situations, as we've just seen, right, with the women's rugby sevens team, to put themselves out there and, advocate for change within their sport, then has made people call into question their actual performance, which is outrageous and really unacceptable. And it's positive to see that Rugby Canada has, taken an immediate stance against that.
Okay. Michelle Donnelly, I got to leave it there this morning. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rosemary.
Michelle Donnelly is an assistant professor of sports management at Brock University. She is or was in St. Catharines, Ontario.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.